It's great to see such a full house so early in the term. Mark Cousins last night in introducing Tony Vidler, I think, touched on the question of the enthusiasm of the audience last night for the lecture. One of the things that I think was, for those of you who were there last night for Tony Vidler's lecture, is this mic on? I think it's, no?
Yeah. Could you press the red button below it?
Okay. I was just talking about the lecture last night that was given by Anthony Vidler. I think towards the end of the lecture, the emphasis was on the Frank Gehry's project for Bilbao. And somehow I think an aspect of that project has to do with the notion of the architectural project as a totality, but a kind of totality that is also self-referential in terms of the many things that it tries to do, sometimes independent of certain site or urban conditions. And I don't want to really spend all our time talking about last night's lecture, but I think one of the things that is interesting about the exhibition that is happening next door in the gallery, the Walsall Gallery project by Caruso St John, is that it actually, in a critical fashion, once again becomes engaged with certain aspects of the project of urbanism with the city, but also this project as a kind of collaborative project, which is not only the work of a single architect, but the way in which, for example, their collaboration with Catherine Yass and Richard Wentworth, with Sergeant Bates in terms of the pub and so on and so forth, begins to create a certain condition of territory that really goes beyond the singularity of the architectural project. I think there are many, many other reasons in terms of the actual focus of the project on aspects of construction, the very fact that in the exhibition we see the beautiful photographs of Hélène Binet related very much to the kind of silence of the working drawings laid on the tables. Here they are, you kind of go through them in a very systematic way. It's actually much more like the idea of the studiolo. You kind of study the work. It's resists somehow that the immediacy of the visual dimension. And I could go on and on and on. But I think the other side of it is really the fact that this project opens up another kind of dimension, which I touched on in the introduction on Monday, working with certain aspects of the work of Team 10, of the Smithsons, and bringing that continuity, bringing that project to the present through an understanding of materials, through an understanding of construction, and really trying to create a kind of lyricism through a methodical reworking of those issues. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing the lecture of Peter and Adam. Would you please join me in welcoming Peter St John and Adam Curuso.
Thank you, MOHSEN. Thanks for inviting us. When we don't have to travel too far away from our office, we both give the lectures, which is good. It's less exhausting. It's increasingly rare, though, that we get to do it together. There's this slew of microphones. We're not going to talk specifically about Walsall, although it's one of the things, one of our projects that we'll show. It would have been, although I was for it, but it would have been perverse not to show it. That's why I like the idea of not showing it. But this is a lecture, and it's an opportunity to articulate. I think my voice is too loud. I can hear it. It's an opportunity for us to articulate where we see our practice now. And that's not a static thing. It changes every 6 months. It changes every 2 months. We're very, very, really the thing that keeps Peter and I going and And I think it's an advantage of working with someone else, because that's the first collaboration. It's the two of us. And we never kind of quibble over whose idea something was. It seems irrelevant and uninteresting. And then there's a collaboration with our office. But the good thing about working with someone else is that the other person always says, that's boring. You've done that. We've done that before. What are we going to do next? And I think that's probably the thing that connects Peter and I together the most, is that we feel it's sort of duplicit and dishonest if we repeat ourselves. It's not, but you'll see from the lecture, we're not interested in novelty either. It's just about using architecture and using our practice as a way of learning things. So we're both going to speak. I'm going to do the first half. Yeah, it'll be probably about the first half, which is more general and which really tries to locate our practice maybe in a more explicit way than we ever have before. And in a way, it was written specially for this place. Because our kind of practice, although I think it's present here now, Sturgis and Bates teach here, and other people. Other kinds of practice exist here as well. And I'm going to try and say why we don't think that kind of practice is our kind of practice. Okay, so I'm going to start by describing another form of practice which is actually very prevalent today and which, even to us, is a theoretically compelling position. Start. The lights. This is a photograph of Atlanta from the airport. Peter and I finally escaped after a week of teaching there. It was my best view of Atlanta. Before we went to Atlanta, our only kind of architectural intellectual guide to the place was Rem Koolhaas's sort of musings on Atlanta. It was before he revised his opinion and admitted it might not be such a great place. We were shocked when we got there and found out what it actually was like. I think Peter was even more shocked because he'd been to less kind of normal American cities than I had. Being Canadian, I've visited almost every state when I was growing up. So one form of architectural practice, which has gained increasing currency as a conceptual position, could be called neo-functionalist or opportunistic. This position assumes that our period represents a fundamental shift away from 400 years of humanist intellectual development. Architecture as a liberal art is an outmoded definition of the discipline, and practice must take closer notice to the workings of the global market economy if it is to continue to be relevant. The processes that enable the expansion of economic, infrastructural, and communication networks must be paralleled by contemporary architectural practice. In becoming descriptive of these dynamic, large-scale processes, architecture gains a renewed legitimacy. The architectural forms that are generated by new kinds of organizational and topographical programs, forms that are only now becoming imaginable through the use of vastly more powerful computers, will be substantially new, and because of their unprecedented programmatic origins, will be independent of our known architectural syntax. I think in this room, a lot of people must know what sort of architecture I'm talking about. The kind of architecture of description that maybe OMA are the most interesting and, for us, still troubling practitioners. Troubling because we still find ourselves kind of sneaking a look at a new project. I mean, this is 2 years ago we were obsessed with OMA, so it's not like we were never we're that far away from it. But there are also people who teach here who in a very articulate and intellectually impressive way, I think, articulate this position theoretically and through their projects. We're very dubious that such a thing as a new, unknown architectural syntax even exists, but we're much more troubled by the motivation to develop that syntax, this motivation of architecture as a descriptive neo-functionalist tool. This position could be called guilt-free or descriptive. The architect is no longer in a position to exercise ethical choices, only to describe kind of the current economic and political kind of situation. New programs are seized as an opportunity to develop new forms at exponentially expanding scales of operation. Inevitably, this seems to result in an architecture of attenuation and of complexity, where bifurcating plates are somehow expressive of optimized programmatic systems and the potential for non-Cartesian space made possible by the new descriptive tools of computers. Although this formal development positively exploits its autonomy from a constructional basis, alongside a mysterious preference for non-Cartesian spatiality is an enthusiasm for as yet undeveloped synthetic materials. This goes beyond people in practice. It's very, very popular in quite a few London schools of architecture as well, ours included, North London included. In the same way that the global market is environmentally unsustainable in its insatiable need for expansion in new markets, the architecture of late capitalism is equally unsustainable, as the market economy requires that we replace consumables at an ever-increasing rate. Its architecture exaggerates the obsolescence of existing structures. As the economy invents previously unknown and unnecessary new markets, architecture follows with strategies of demolition and of expansion. In exploiting cheap land outside urban areas, this architecture can become ever larger and more cost-effective. Development of territories that were previously deemed underused by current economic models generate the need for new infrastructure, which consume yet more land. In the context of Europe, certainly Northern Europe and Western Europe, there seems to be, I think all of Europe actually, there seems to be clear alternatives to this kind of expansive progress in the densification of existing settlements. Applied to the territories of developing economies, these arguments are more compelling. But it seems to us they shouldn't be blindly followed, or the environmental catastrophe of Soviet industrialization will just be repeated for yet another kind of abstracted economic model, a kind of a model which is taken as true, but which I suspect if you ever tested in an impartial way, if that's possible, I don't think it actually is, would be as true as any other economic model, like Soviet centralized economy on the one hand, or kind of free market, global market economy. So that's the first kind of practice, neo-functionalist, opportunistic. There's another kind of practice. This is the kind of practice that we're trying to align with. That could be called critical or reflexive. Rather than align itself with the neoliberal economic hegemony, and by working within a traditional liberal arts context, this form of practice is able to pass comment on the status quo, as art practice has done for the last 50 years in a very explicit way, and before that in less explicit ways. In small ways, this practice can put forward ameliorative strategies and paradigms that might suggest what could come after the global market and might remind us of the things that are excluded in that social model. And there are an awful lot of things and an awful lot of people who are excluded. This form of practice, which is more fully developed in art than in architecture, is not so obsessed with the new as was the previous model. A work like Robert Smithson's Spiral Jetty is powerful because of the way it brings together a familiar, almost archetypal form and contemporary means of production. It exposes something new, in this case the operation of dumper trucks moving earth, that suggests that many other equally banal actions could have the unexpected, latent potential. Like much of Smithson's work, Spiral Jetty suggests that quite subtle shifts in our perception can open up disproportionately wide areas of potential within existing means of means or conditions of production. So we're not that interested in new materials, although new materials do emerge and they have their place. We're not that interested in new geometric spatialities. We're interested in kind of understanding more about one's experience of spatial conditions. We're not that eager to express or to serve the global market. Complexity and Contradictions in Architecture by Venturi began to make the connection between a sensibility like Smithson's and a new inclusive kind of architecture. The subsequent marginalization of Venturi's position within the profession, even within his own practice, I think is not so surprising. Firstly, the book's assertion that architecture inevitably signifies many things rather than just a few was taken up by the profession as a call to reevaluate the history of architectural forms. And quite disappointingly, in his foreword to the second edition, Venturi says he should have called the book Complexity and Contradiction in Architectural Form. Even he, I think, is retreating from some of the political significance that his book holds, if you read it in a certain way at least. I think that's exactly what the book was taken as. And things like postmodern classicism or any other ism, they could be codified, and they were quickly assimilated by conventional architectural practice. Once that happens, of course, they're out of style as far as the avant-garde is concerned, and you have a vicious cycle of a new commodity and consuming that commodity, and the commodity is no longer interesting. For academics, Venturi's inclusivity threw wide open what could validly be discussed in the schools. This has resulted in a lasting legacy of ever more arcane subjects of study being taken up in preference to what had previously constituted the core of the discipline of architecture. I think Europe is not as far along that path as North America is, but I think it's a very disturbing. As architecture seems to become marginalized within the context of reality, the academies can no longer seems interesting or relevant to supply kind of the real world, and I understand that. And so more and more arcane subjects are taken up within the schools, and the schools become increasingly separated from practice and from reality. And architecture starts to become something else. The second reason, which I think more seriously kind of undermined Venturi's, the kind of longevity of Venturi's theoretical position, was that a neoliberal economy prefers neo-functionalist architecture, which is satisfied with cultivating its own small patch within the system, rather than work which is a critique of the system itself. Apart from a small number of mostly European architects, the ambition of architectural practice has been more and more fully defined by forces outside of the discipline. This is in sharp contrast to art practice, which, despite similarities in market and institutional pressures, but perhaps because of its much smaller scale of operation, has been able to remain a viable critical practice. So if architecture is to be an effective critique of the extremes of contemporary development, it needs to engage more fully, this is our position, it needs to engage more fully with the enormous emotional range held within our existing places of inhabitation. Venturi's call for an architecture of inclusion must be worth revisiting, but with a stronger emphasis on construction and on the emotional presence of places to protect this discourse from being reduced to one purely of appearance or style, to one purely of semiotics. The postmodern condition cannot be avoided. It can be viewed as a wave that, once mounted, is completely in control of the surfer's ride. Or our situation can be recognized and engaged with on conventional artistic terms, where a heightened sensitivity, a heightened suspicion of what's going on around us allows us to cut ever more closely to the status quo. The artist is not a helpless surfer, And ever more than science, even more than science, art imagines and conceptualizes the concrete fact of the contemporary condition. I think some architects can be artists, or can at least aspire to be artists. Okay. Be a little less abstract now. When Joseph Beuys was reconstructing the practice of art in post-war Germany, his work was intentionally inexplicable, rejecting a priori theories as a valid basis for art. Instead, he drew on emotional and intuitive forces deep within himself in order to articulate this condition of starting anew and to connect as directly as possible with the viewer. The seeming irrationalism of his work could be seen as a direct critique of the productivist ethic of the post-war era, which itself could be seen as an extension of the wartime economy, of the logics that were set up by the wartime economy. Far from being naive, this work was a powerful critique of the quasi-religious status that science and progress had achieved. The work had an open environmental quality that articulated a new relationship between the viewer and the artwork, one which predicted a wider and a deeper audience for new art. Beuys's ambition, indeed he said it was already the case, was that everyone was an artist. And I think what he meant by that was that really being an artist is taking some notice of what's going on around you, of trying to tune just a little bit your sensitivity to your condition, your social condition, I think, first. I think that's what Beuys was most concerned about, not about kind of your aesthetic condition. There's a group of contemporary artists whose work develops Beuys's attempt to prioritize intuitive forms of knowledge or intuitive forms of intelligence over kind of a positivist, conventional scientific knowledge. The work of artists like Robert Gober, Juan Munoz, and Katharina Fritsch use the human figure and objects from everyday life. But rather than use these forms with any explicitly iconographic intent, as would have been the case in historical figurative art, this work attempts to operate first and foremost at an emotional level. The image in this work, with its strong associations to childhood and to the home and to national myth, appeals to such commonly held experiences that one forms a strong feeling about the work almost as soon as one sees it, as soon as one is in the physical presence of the work. In common with much conceptual sculpture, this work attempts to operate primarily by way of the object, seeking to short-circuit any didactic or literary readings. Unlike the work of Donald Judd, who quite unconvincingly claimed to eliminate associative readings in his work, the work of these younger artists intentionally contains a surfeit of emotional content, which emerges simultaneously from the image and from the fabric of the artifact. This is a very short quote from an interview with Katharina Fritsch. Why does everything have to come back to concepts? Being disturbed visually, experiencing ambivalence, why does one have to go straight into the language cage? It's just an escape into didacticism. A very important element in my work is that you come in, experience an image, allow yourself to be drawn in, perceive it directly. And then she goes on, I'll just sort of paraphrase. I mean, what she means is that as soon as you describe it with language, as soon as you try to explain it away in a text, somehow you've put it in a drawer. And she thinks that the compulsion, not just amongst critics, but amongst kind of art-consuming society generally, is that there's a discomfort if you can't locate art. And the way you locate art is about writing about it. She's interested in what happens before it's written about. Vernacular buildings operate in a similar way. Vernacular constructions are not architecture. Unlike architecture, they are not a self-conscious act. They do not exist through formal abstractions independent of construction. The vernacular is not about appearance, but about presence. It is a physical artifact which contains within itself the continuously evolving social and technological situation in which it was built. Vernacular constructions are increasingly difficult to define. Globalization of technology and information has made the local a more complex condition. However, the ad hoc manner in which forms are built up in the vernacular, through agglomeration and adding, the slow and steady way in which technologies are taken up into a tradition, these things are still worthy of study. One is not interested in a new vernacular, but in giving a higher priority to the emotional experience of buildings and developing an understanding of how fabrication can hold emotional intent. Okay. Now Peter's going to explain a few of our projects. Is that enough? This will be fine.
This is one of the buildings we did like in Atlanta. In a minute I'm going to show you, try and relate the ideas that Adam was talking about in relation to our built work, and I'm going to show you 4 projects. And I want to try and talk about these projects with an emphasis that reflects our particular interests, not particularly talking about them in terms of the complexities of accommodating functions, because those requirements are usually given and outside our control. And increasingly the plans of our buildings are as simple and as direct as we can make them. We're interested in kind of judging buildings by their character and in the way in which they communicate to you through their language and their physical presence. And because of this emphasis on emotional content, I think increasingly we're interested in the world of buildings that you see out there, out of the window, and judging architecture in relation to the environment that you live with every day. Perhaps more of an interest in the background of the city. And those interests aren't unique. We have many friends and other architects in London who have shaped them for us, but I think it would be too politically complicated to name them all. We particularly enjoy vernacular buildings because of the way in which their dignity comes not from specific architectural endeavour. There aren't architects involved in making them, but from received and repeated, understood and agreed language, and from their specific conditions of production. And of course, as architects, we could never do that. But we're interested in making work with that same direct physical character that comes from association with known things and personal experience. We enjoy buildings, for example, such as this Victorian factory in Clerkenwell, whose overall form and appearance has come out of very simple and direct requirements made visible, in this case by a sequential adding of parts, making an overall form which is agglomerative, not planned, but bound together by material. And we enjoy the feeling of buildings that use materials in very simple, direct, no-nonsense ways, whose character comes from decisions made without hesitation and where the application of the material is what gives it its appearance, such as this shed in a cement factory outside Rugby, where the cladding is one of the products of the process housed inside the building. Okay, it's the first project. This is a two-storey house in a mews in Islington near Highbury Corner, which is Adam's house. And our interest in looking at the world around us for ideas and for what to work with means that we start with the found things. And in this case, we kind of saw the existing building as as our site. And we've never given truly more value to making buildings afresh, making new buildings, over working with existing buildings and keeping things. We think that both are equally able to hold meaning, and we think that environmentally you should always start from the assumption of favouring reuse. So in the case of this building, we enjoyed the building for its marks and its scars and the texture of the walls, which reflected many previous uses. And we tried to add the new work strategically, only where necessary. So the ground floor of the building, which is between other buildings, didn't require insulation, but the upper floor did because it's exposed. So the upper floor is lined with insulation and plasterboard. The tectonic of this building is extremely basic, so we made the additions with very ordinary lowly materials which were applied in their found form rather than with a minimum of shaping, with their thicknesses apparent. So in a way the kind of idea of thickness became the consistent way of detailing, and we used concrete, stud work, plasterboard, MDF, lino, plastic, insulation, glass. No products, only materials. And through this very direct application of material, we were trying to make an equivalence between the existing fabric and the new, so that the house became, the kind of character of the house came from this quality of addition, and its variety came from the given. And the upper story of the house was lined with feather edge board, plasterboard sheets, so that the skim joints of the plasterboard became yet another texture of the walls and ceilings. Outside, we wanted the building to feel quite big onto the mews. For a while it was our office, so in a way it was something of an advertisement for Caruso St John architects. And we made the window by placing the glass onto the face of the brick building, over the top of, and more generous than the two openings in the brick wall. We wanted the window to feel like it was an assembly of parts, so that the window is made out of sheets which are just sitting on the horizontal trays of the window. And the door and the pieces of wall that open for ventilation are made in fibre cement, which is a kind of similar tone to the tone of the glass, in order to make this kind of equivalence between the materials. And the glass is made of Ocalux, which is a kind of insulating double glazed unit. We've always enjoyed the broken fabric and additive character of London, and the way in which that kind of idea of a city accepts new appearance amongst the old without too much fuss. And we think that kind of idea of a city, of that kind of tolerance, is very liberating, and it's kind of something of an inspiration for us. So at the rear of the building, the evidence of the house is a piece that's kind of scaled to the other pieces of building in the muse, and the extent of the building is ambiguous and doesn't need to be clearly defined. That didn't seem important. Okay, the second project is for a house, for a doctor and a craft artist in the Fenlands near Boston. And the site for the house was on the edge of a village overlooking these amazing flat fields. And we were amazed by the way in which the flat surface of the Fenland had this effect of transforming one's perception of the house, making its shape and its compactness much more abstract and singular, like a single object on a table. The house is in the center of the image, in front of the trees, and the client's derelict barn is off to the right, and the house is between the church and the barn. And in choosing a direction for what this house would look like, what kind of image we wanted to make for this house, which was our first new building, we rejected the idea that we should work within the conventions of modernist form, which is perhaps, maybe I'm being unfair, but perhaps a kind of obvious decision that we perhaps could have taken, and in a way the client and even the planners were quite supportive of us doing something adventurous. Hopefully we still did that. But we decided to make a house that was much more recognizably house-like, with a concrete tile pitched roof and a freestanding garage and a porch, which was using many of the conventions of bungalows that are common in the area. But at the same time, we distorted the kind of shape of the roof of the building in order to give its different elevations completely different scales, so that it has a kind of certain scale to the road, a more generous scale to the open field off to the right, kind of really tight scale to the south-facing garden on the left. And we made slightly peculiar shapes to the walls, and generally we tried to give the kind of detailing of the building a completely different character to that which you might expect, so that this initial impression of the building being house-like was undercut by these things, and that in a way kind of recognized the very kind of powerful and abstracting character of this landscape. And we think that those things were much more poignant, this kind of sharp, abrupt character of the building, much more poignant because of judging it in relation to one's understanding of a house. And the elevations of the house were loose and strangely scaled, not trying to, in a way, trying to make ambiguous the scale of the building. And they have a kind of, to us, that kind of affecting character of child's drawings of houses that have the elements but at slightly exaggerated scales. And in this case, the windows are placed not according to any hierarchy, but actually placed in relation to spaces inside the building. We were interested in kind of making this detailed character of the building by working positively with the very banal technology of construction of these buildings. We actually tried to build it in timber frame, brick clad, but were defeated. So we worked with the kind of brick cavity block construction, which our builder rose to, and trying to make the brick take on that character of being the kind of rain screen layer that a cavity wall construction actually is. So we made the windows flush to the surface of the brick. We never allowed the edge of the brick to be revealed, so that the brick becomes like a stretched skin over the surface of the building. And we also had faces of the building that were clad in black stained plywood to the right of this image. And the corners, the meeting points of these two materials, the brick and the ply, were detailed in such that they were made completely equivalent, so they both felt sheet-like and stretched. And the inside of the house, I think this is a nice image, but in a way I'd be much more satisfied with an image that showed the way in which it's occupied, because the inside of the house is very grand in relation to the quite small scale of the house, in that the living room is a hall, which is directly the resultant form of the shape of the roof, and all the other rooms open directly into the hall, so that there's a kind of generosity to that living space, which opens onto other rooms and has big windows looking out onto the fields. A kind of generosity, but and in a way a kind of formality, but not in such a way that it tells you how to use it. Okay. Third project is talking about the Walsall Art Gallery. This is actually the Walsall Town Hall, which was built in 1901, was actually also the subject of a competition. And the gallery project, which is in the exhibition next door, was a competition, an open international competition, which we won 2 years ago. And obviously, the gallery will become a very major new public building at the centre of the town, and is going to be a home for the permanent collection, the Garman Ryan collection, donated to the town by Sally Ryan and Kathleen Garman, the wife of Jacob Epstein, which is presently housed in that Carnegie Library in the centre of the image, and also a building housing a major regional temporary exhibition gallery. And like many towns in the Midlands, Walsall has a number of public buildings of reasonable quality, many of them Victorian, and many buildings around of very dubious quality, of commercial buildings. And the public institutions, like the town hall here, have a permanence, and the commercial buildings change and are replaced. And the centre of Walsall is a very mixed kind of city centre. And we thought that permanence of the institution was an appropriate image to the new gallery, and also very useful to the definition of the town. This is a little site model. So the site is at the edge of the town centre. This is the high street coming up from the left, and the building is located on the end of a canal arm which comes into the edge of the town. It's kind of axially located on the canal in such a way that the canal and its towpath become part of the space affected by the building, and it kind of has the character of like a railway station terminating importantly on the edge of the town. And the site for the gallery is surrounded by some kind of early 90s pseudo-Victorian British Home Stores and Woolworth buildings, a 15-story high 1970s office slab and a Victorian leatherworking factory. And we liked the way, although initially we kind of threw up our hands in horror by its immediate neighbours, we actually now rather enjoy the way in which all of these architectures are so close and adjacent, all of them with their own very particular implications of urbanism, radically compromised, giving us something of a freedom to work with all of them, but not being bound by any of them. And our proposal was to stack the programme of the gallery into a tower, so that the building would be prominent and visible from most places within the town, to give that tower a profile, so again that kind of role of orientation would be made even more apparent. And also that by making the building high, it gave more of the site over to a public open space that would be the kind of setting of the building. And I have to kind of give you some information about the way the building works, I think, because I don't want you to think that it's totally ridiculous, the kind of tower-like idea of the building. So the idea of stacking the building onto different floors was that each of the different programs of the building could have their own floor, a kind of acceptably sized territory. Each of those floors could have their own floor-to-ceiling height that was appropriate to the use on that floor. And in a way, that will allow, because the floors are primarily accessed by lift, that will allow each of the floors of the building to operate independently. And at the same time, which is what this model, early model, which was only kind of 6 inches high, was about, it's also a building which is very compact. So all of those different kinds of programs are actually very close together, and there are public staircases which individually connect one floor to the other, allowing those adjacencies to be quite closely felt and allowing a kind of another way of experiencing the building, which is of wandering through it. And we thought of the building as being like a big house, which has a kind of quite powerful overall form and no obligation to express the very wide variety of scales of space within it. So I'm just going to briefly take you through the different levels of the building. Let's have another drink. This is the ground floor plan, which is kind of centered on the foyer, surrounded by a series of other rooms, children's gallery, reception, toilets, and the ubiquitous gallery shop. And on this floor, you can feel the full width of the building and the sense of the kind of tower above you. The main stairs leading to a mezzanine with a library ahead of you, an education room to the left, and the stair up to the right takes you to the first floor and the permanent collection suite of rooms, and the lifts are on the right. And the structure of the building is a shell, which is kind of primarily what those photographs in the gallery next door are about. A mass concrete shell with a very fine precast concrete joist floor construction. And that shell is consistent throughout the whole of the building and apparent in the larger public spaces of the building, and in smaller spaces it's lined by timber and plasterboard. And in a room like this, there's a combination of timber wall panelling and exposed concrete walls which have a cast timber finish which is identical to it's a kind of cast of the panelling. The plan of the first floor is a series of perimeter rooms with the permanent collection as that shaded area arranged around a hall which connects the two levels of the rooms. and education rooms below, just across the long gallery from the gallery spaces. So this is a photograph of the hall, which is lined in timber, which looks beyond to alcoves off the hall and through doors into rooms around the perimeter of the plan. And one of the rooms for the permanent collection. And there are 13 rooms of this kind of scale because the collection is arranged into groups of paintings arranged around themes, and each of the rooms has a window, and that combination of directional, natural light coming in through one wall of the room and a general light in the center and the ability to spotlight from that fitting allows the uneven direction of the light naturally to give different areas of light in the room, which allows us to display in the same room works of different kinds of light sensitivity. It's also obviously most powerfully the idea of exhibiting this collection in rooms of a domestic scale, because that was where they were originally placed. And the third floor is a suite of much larger rooms, the biggest one being 25 meters long by 10 meters wide, which are all connected and can be used together or in smaller combinations. And in these rooms, which have concrete floors and lined walls, the light is still coming from the side, but consistently from high-level clear story lighting above 4.5 meters. So the light is thrown deeply into the space, and the precast concrete joist ceiling is the kind of location for other fittings. Okay. The kind of detail of the entrance of the building. The building is clad in terracotta tiles, which there are samples in the exhibition. We were interested in the weight and detail of those various Victorian and Edwardian buildings in the town. And so the building is clad in tiles, which give the surface of the building a kind of consistent texture of shadow, even in the very dullest of light, which is what it's like most of the time. And the windows to all of those spaces that I described are placed in the facade according to where they're wanted by the plan, without any particular hierarchy. So what we kind of enjoy about it is these kind of two scales of the building, that you see the building from a very long way off, and it has a very kind of powerful profile to it. And the other way in which you see the building is when you're almost standing under it, and that again kind of should have this kind of quite fine fabric-like texture, and perhaps it's the kind of intermediate scale of the building which is deliberately not expressed. And we detailed the windows so that the glass is flush with the frame and proud of the terracotta tiling, so that the windows become, when you look up at them, when you're standing adjacent to the building, like sheets, pieces of the reflecting the sky, like tiles in themselves. The public space around the building I'm not going to describe because it's for other people to talk about, I think. But it's designed by Richard Wentworth and Catherine Yass, with Lynn Kinnear, the landscape architect. And the pub in the top right-hand corner is designed by Jonathan Surgeson and Stephen Bates with our support. And we kind of our kind of first contribution was perhaps to encourage that involvement of those people and kind of shape the space in such a way that it's both loose and generous and allows those different kinds of contributions and collaborations to happen. I'm going to talk lastly, be another 5 minutes, about a competition design which we made last year for a concert hall and gallery in Jyväskylä in Finland, which is located at the centre of the town on the edge of the main town square, between two buildings by Alvar Aalto, one kind of early 1920s alto with a kind of very strong civic and classical character, and the other one alto from the 50s, very much more fluid, organic, and quite a kind of difficult kind of place in which to do a building. This isn't it. This is a 200-year-old church from a small town outside Jyväskylä, and we enjoyed the language of this building. We looked at a number of other timber buildings. The language of these early civic buildings, which used the tectonic of timber construction in a much more formal way than is usual. And we had this idea of making a very strong civic facade between these buildings from a material that would be that is identified with Jyväskylä, because it's famous for its timber production and its paper making, but with a material that is not usually regarded as today as having sufficient weight and seriousness for an urban project. And the project was for the restoration of the Alto building, which is on the left, partially for use as the new gallery, and the new building to the right, which was both concert hall and gallery space. And the facade of our building was made by a screen of stacked timber logs, solid section, 300 by 300, which were detailed to allow the timber to, like the previous image, move, crack, and turn to black over a period of time. And try and use that material in such a way that the solidity and weight of it gave it an appropriately civic character. And the interior of the auditorium for 1,000 people was made out of a smooth concrete shell, and there were some concerns expressed by the judges about the reverberative acoustic material and shape of this room. And the gallery spaces were also made out of this concrete shell with walls for display of art. And to the right is a window overlooking a courtyard at the centre of the building. So we tried to make a space at the centre of the building from which you could see, when you were inside it, the concert hall and the gallery and the Alto building across a space which is an inaccessible courtyard, and the whole interior of the building was clad in white vitreous pantiles, and this is the kind of outside of the building with the top of the concert hall visible over the cladding. That's it, thank you.
I hope that there'll be some questions from the audience. I would probably like to start with a request for a little bit of clarification in terms of the first part of the presentation and your critique of the new and some of the things that might be happening in this place, and and the relationship of that to the idea of history and the past, and in particular then the first projects that you showed, which dealt with the idea of modification, for example. I think it would be interesting if you could clarify what your attitude is really more specifically to this question of the past and the present, or the past and the new. Basically, it seems that there is one way that, for example, the house could be interpreted in terms of its relationship to the past in the way that someone like Beigel in the 19th century discussed this thing, where he was talking about the concept of age value. And the concept of age value for him was the way in which, for example, the idea of the old itself also assumed a kind of aesthetic quality. It had a value. And it's not quite clear to me why, for example, you think that on the interior of the house, when you make this modification, that what existed there before, the memory of what existed there, should now have an aesthetic value. Clearly, it touches on the history and the meaning of this building in the past, but there is also the moment at which you are adding to something and making the old anew, whether you like it or not. It's a reality. So somehow it seems to me that a certain kind of clarification is necessary, because even then when you make the new, for example, in terms of the plasterboard and not painting it and all of that, there is an attempt to try and create the thing as if it was a kind of pre-existing condition, by not somehow confronting the fact that this is something new. It becomes a kind of aesthetic operation because it aestheticizes the old and it creates a new, which is an aesthetic new. So maybe if it's possible that you could touch on this question of the old and the new, I'd be grateful.
Very long question. Our position is ambiguous. I mean, but we like ambiguity. You asked two things. I mean, your observations about the first house, my house. That was a house that has three distinct histories already. I mean, functional histories, but also kind of physical histories. It had been added to. It had been added and kind of messed about with in quite an extreme way, actually. And what we were interested in was to make something which was new in it, and it's clearly a new part, but that would be just another edition, right? So that our new part wouldn't try and idealize the old part, wouldn't try and emasculate the old part, but would be alongside the existing. I mean, we had to choose what we kept. We always choose, and that's part of our position, that if you're working in, whether it's a site or an existing building, the biggest choices you make are about what you keep, even before you make any formal proposition. And this seemed like quite a compelling way of showing that. So it didn't become a kind of a Scarpa project where the old and the new were almost hysterically delineated. It tried to make them alongside each other. And you're right, the new had to be a little bit kind of shaggy around the edges, or else it would have been gleaming, right? It would have put the old to shame. Instead, you're trying to discover a tectonic where the new has an analogous kind of roughness or smoothness to what's already there. And you make a new hole, and a new hole which then can be modified again, because to make a renovation project which idealizes what was already there seems very arrogant and very hopeful. Well, not hopeful, I wouldn't find it hopeful, but it seems kind of not very realistic. The regal thing you were talking about, I don't think we value the old in that way. Although we can't escape it, we're not so interested in the semiotics of our buildings. We're more interested in the constructional syntax, which we know will throw up a system of signs. But we'd rather let them be a little bit less in our control. And I think that's why we showed Katerina Fritsch, and I think all three artists who we showed, I don't think they're nostalgic artists. And this kind of value of the old, and I don't mind nostalgia, but I'm more interested in sentiment. And I'm more interested in the kind of emotional resonance or reaction, or the pathos that one has when Peter was describing the kind of front elevation of the house. It's pathetic in some ways. We couldn't get the windows to line up or anything, and I don't think that's valuing the old. It's trying to make something which has a pathos. The pathos is, the world is full of it, and it's an immediate emotional quality. The new, I don't want to go on, I want another question, but just the thing, maybe someone else will ask about the new.
Is there a microphone here?
Hi. The earlier house projects, they seem to show a kind of interest in using low-grade, industrial-grade materials in a kind of domestic context. There's kind of incongruity there, which is maybe like the way kind of Sterling might have used engineering products in an academic context in the 60s. And I remember hearing Peter in the past say that if you'd had more money on those projects, you would have just chosen to make them bigger rather than necessarily out of other materials. With the experience of working on Walsall, where you've clearly had a huge quantity of money to play with, how's that impacted on your kind of your interest in using those sort of materials?
Peter's tired.
Well, the thing about Walsall is that, and we're perfectly aware of how lucky we are. It's an amazing opportunity with incredible support from people, and that there was a real determination on the part of our kind of individual client and of the town to build something of real quality, and that was expected. And a real concern that so many lottery projects don't ask for enough money to deliver what they say they're going to, because it's so difficult to know what things are going to cost at the outset. But there was a real kind of intention to build something of quality and something that would last. And also kind of politically, it was really important, I think, that there was seemed to be a kind of significant investment in a really high quality building, not in London. So it was really an expectation that the building would have real longevity, that it would last for 50 or 60 or more years. Obviously, different parts of the building have different lives, but a real intention to build well, and it's kind of an opportunity you don't throw up.
With that said, I mean, the materials are still, the primary floor material is power-floated concrete. There's a lot of concrete, which in itself, there's no stone in the building. There's wood paneling, it's softwood paneling. It's the hardest softwood you can get, but it's, I mean, one has a responsibility that the thing will perform for its life. And yeah, they're not as obviously modest, but that just didn't seem technically, one doesn't have to embarrass, I mean, we're not embarrassed by it, but I don't think one will go in and think that these are very opulent materials. They're actually quite ordinary, but they're kind of shifted, the ordinariness. In Sweden, I had a big kind of discussion about exactly that thing. He was sort of deeply troubled that this building seemed expensive to him, and it was an interesting discussion. Same point really that you're making.
You can afford a decent thickness of stainless steel, should we say?
Pardon?
You can afford a decent thickness of stainless steel.
Well, and stainless, I mean, we're using stainless steel because you bend it and that's it. It's stainless steel and bronze are becoming just a bit more expensive than coated aluminiums now because there's less operations. And then the thickness of stainless steel at the ground, we need a certain thickness for vandals. But above, for making the pressings for the windows, using a thinner stainless steel would have made the welding more difficult. So in the end, it's the same effort, less effort, same cost to use a kind of 1.5 mil stainless steel. The stainless steel, though, is It's mill finished, has no finish to it. It's as it comes out of the mill, off the coil. So it's a good material, but we're trying to use it in quite a basic way.
At the back
He's gonna kill us.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask you a question about the way you described your buildings, because in your preamble you talked about them being about experience, about emotion, and you stated that again in a way at the end. And then the way you described them was very sort of cold and clinical in terms of the materials that were used. And there did seem to be I found it frustrating that there wasn't anything about the people who were going to use this building and what they would feel or touch, or what you wanted, the kind of experience you wanted to create with those materials that you were choosing very carefully. I just wondered if that was intentional, or because it seemed like there was there was a hell of a lot of thought and work had gone into what you had been choosing, and then when you described it, I got no sense of how the building would be used or the people that were going to inhabit it.
I mean, we don't know how the buildings will be used. When we've done quite a few houses, and we usually try and get our clients to write at least an A3 kind of brief wish list. And it's never very difficult getting the rooms to work, but we try to get them to describe what they should feel like and things they like. And sometimes the clients let us see their previous house. Almost in every case they don't, actually. They don't want us to see it. They're embarrassed. But in the end, and I, without exception, we're friends with those clients. And the way the houses are when they've inhabited them with their furniture, usually with a lot less furniture. They usually get rid of most of their furniture and they buy a bit of new furniture. But the way the spaces are inhabited hugely enrich the quality of the space. But what we're interested in is, if we're doing a house, what we're thinking about is making it house-like, making it homely, right? That's the emotion. And we have ideas of what homely are, and we try and talk about them with the client. But we want there to be enough looseness so that there's all sorts of ways they can use the house. Because, I mean, our view is that the buildings we really like are like buildings, or a Georgian terrace house like this, or monasteries, or very generalized building typologies, and where there's just a real generosity of space and quite a strong spatial character that comes from the tectonic. And then the use actually can shift, because that's to do with the new. If you have a building that kind of you want to be in, you make a bit of effort to kind of convert it from a house into a school, or from a warehouse into a gallery. If it hardly gives you anything when you remove the kind of interior fit out, well, then you're maybe more tempted to demolish that building.
I also think we're interested in making places, and that's why we put so much emphasis on describing things in terms of the way they are, and the way in which they are a thing. And we'd be very happy with giving a lecture about the construction drawings only, but I mean, I thought I was being really passionate in my description of those spaces. but at the same but we don't believe in kind of trying to say how those things are being used, and I know that there's a kind of reading of the way we make our architecture, which is that it's highly aestheticized, and because of the way in which we show our buildings through kind of highly formalized photographs, where we can take a lot of care over their quality. But that's not to say we're not interested in use. We just don't believe that it's right to be too prescriptive about your idea about how people use things. And we think it's better to kind of stand back from that a bit.
I just think there are like generic things like city, whatever, which everyone does, which
But that house in Lincolnshire, they have a 20-foot long dining room table. It was a given. They weren't getting rid of it. And they love cooking, they use it a lot. We had to design a space specifically for that table. Okay? And it was the one thing that we argued with them over. We did it, not just how it would work. Then they moved in, and we came over, and the table was somewhere completely different. Completely different. And the window that we'd done for a sofa had the table, and it was really nice. They had some kind of loomed decoys and the telephone, and they would work at the desk. And after 6 months, it was irritating because they'd have to pull the table out when they had guests. So they put it back to where we thought it would be. But it wasn't like, first of all, we didn't tell them, what the hell are you doing? You know, get it back over there. Because it's their house. And it wasn't that much, you know, I think it's a bit better where it belongs because it's such a long table. But they move the stuff around, you know, they have some fantastic paintings and other things, just objects, and they move them around, and they have confidence to do that, and that's an achievement. They don't have to worry about ruining the interior.
Why is the specifically constructional vernacular so important to you, given that Venturi, for example, made the case for signs and billboards and large figurative objects being the vernacular as well, and given that a lot of contemporary artists have also worked with that sort of material?
I think, but I mean, Venturi's practice, he's done a few amazing buildings, but it's been largely a failure, I think.
Yeah,
and I think working in North America, first of all, is completely different than working, say, in Britain and a few other European countries. I mean, architects are so what's the word? I mean, have been so divested of their responsibility and their engagement, their participation in construction. But I mean, I think that was the point we were trying to make. That was one of his errors. I think when he wrote Complexity and Contradiction, it was less obvious, and he was making real connections to art practice. But I think it's very different for a painter to appropriate a two-dimensional, sign from advertising or something, because it's actually the medium. There's no shift in the medium. I think vernacular is fun. Vernacular building is fundamentally engaged with construction and technology and its social situation. It's kind of this incredible melding of those things.
So you don't think there's a kind of figurative vernacular that's relevant to building?
Not a independent. That's well, this week. That's what we think. We wouldn't make a shape and then figure out how it was built, ever.
Why not?
Well, we just
But also there's those kind of interests in those signs are very much to do with kind of perception, an idea that architects should think about the way people really perceive buildings, which in that culture is from cars, and I don't think that I think that kind of interest has been borrowed inappropriately in the European context, but we are interested in those ideas of scale, which that kind of thing relates to, and we kind of think about that very much.
I appreciate the sort of simplicity of the built work that you've shown, and also the proliferation of projects that you've done in such a short time, and especially the detail that you showed, because that does show that there is a great sophistry of how you put your work together. But there's a but coming. I do sense that there's in the discourse of the first half of the lecture a kind of disappointment in how a negation of the pursuit of novelty as the cultural pursuit of your practice. I was also impressed that there is a substitute for the pursuit of novelty, that of material investigation, which is certainly valid and one has to respect. But I'd like to know that there's a statement made about each time you start a project, you try to do something new, or you possibly paraphrasing, you attempt to do something you haven't done before. Then in what sense can one understand the status of novelty, and also then what is the status of knowledge in your work, maybe not so much in your work, but what the status of knowledge is in your backgrounds, and then how it relates to what it means to do something new each time you approach a project.
For us,
If I can address that to you, Adam.
for us to do something new, that's what I meant. First of all, we've done a few projects that we think our projects resemble each other too much, and that's inexperience. Okay, so hopefully we're becoming more formally adept. But the idea of doing something, it's not that it's new, but it's about moving forward. It is about moving forward. It's about learning. Every job we've done, we have a kind of contractual disaster, and you learn from that, right? And you have a kind of technical sticky point, and you learn from that. Well, why shouldn't one kind of formally and artistically also learn from each project? I mean, the artists whose work we really admire, the reason they make the work is to find out about things. And it seems to us architecture is incredibly well placed to teach you about your situation and what goes on around you. And so it's really about building on the last project. But also, if your projects are going to try to be highly specific to their situation, why should they look the same? Why should a building in Jyväskylä look like a building in Walsall? They do have some similarities, I must say, but then there are also some real big differences. Or when we've done competitions in Japan, those projects are very, very different than, say, projects that we do here. And we always do them with some trepidation, because it would probably kill us if we had to do something in Japan. The loss of closeness to the building process would be very traumatic, I think. So I don't think it is novelty. I don't think any of our projects are original. They're all equally unoriginal. They're all equally kind of influenced by the things that we're interested in at the time, and they're all attempting to engage with kind of highly specific situations. And I think that takes a lot of work. I think that's difficult.
Well, I think we'll have, I guess. There are perhaps three words which stand out in my mind, which you have used. There is material, there is construction, and there is emotion. Yeah. Now, to me, that's all right. At first, it reminds me of perhaps Le Corbusier. Yeah. But then I think again, and knowing you a bit, I think perhaps about the Smithsons, and I start to wonder, well, is that what you mean? That is that something to do with the brutalism of material and a particular approach to facts, something to do with something which is beneath the surface of things, and so on? And somehow I think, well, maybe that's not it. And then I carry on, and I think, well, maybe it might have something to do with critical architecture, since the word critical has come up. So I started to think of Kenneth Frampton, regionalism, and an architecture which oppose what you have called the globalization, Rem Koolhaas, and so on. And then I think, well, if that's it, then maybe I am a bit disappointed. And then there comes a third possibility, and at that point I am not sure, and perhaps you will explain. But I have a feeling it's something to do with the connection with place. But there are maybe other things. And what I want to ask you is why you actually attach such importance to the material quality of things and to construction. That is, why do you actually think it is important to architecture? It is to the experience of which people have of architecture.
I'll start. We're physical, and we occupy a position on the ground. And buildings occupy positions on the ground through their physical constitution. So as things that sort of displace air, we're most like buildings in that we both displace volume of air. right? So one can have a kind of a visceral, kind of very a personal response to physical things. And nowadays, and this is sort of part of globalization, there aren't as many shared iconographies. You can't assume that someone will share your interpretation of an iconograph, of an icon, of an ad or whatever, of responding to anything. It's just like, you go and see a film and someone else sees a film and you can't believe you've seen the same film. I suspect, in Counter-Reformation Rome, when they went to see Il Gesù, and you were kind of a almost lapsing Catholic and you went to Il Gesù, you were, 95% of the people, they were brought back into the fold because that was the purpose and they knew how to play that knowledge. So material seems to become really important in a time when everybody's telling you how everyone's the same and how communication seems to get faster and faster. But that sounds sort of fundamentalist. I mean, it isn't meant to be fundamentalist. The thing about places, I think, is a real response to modernism, but even to things that Team 10 did. I think we both have a real aversion to generic, prototypical work. We think that the idea that you could make a prototype for something and repeat it was the cause of most of the architectural horrors that took place in the 50s and 60s. It wasn't because the architects were evil, for sure, and it wasn't because most of the clients were evil either. Everyone was very well-meaning, but I think they had a real task to produce a lot of houses, a lot of offices, a lot of factories. And in some contexts it worked, like SOM building the same factory in 20 places in the United States. It worked perfectly for that. That was a good use of a kind of productivist ethos. But nowadays, I mean, maybe it's a loss of nerve, but we feel safer just working in one little place at a time, and trying to read that place as carefully as we can. So once the building's built there, you haven't blocked too many things that were used, so that it already sort of has been slightly appropriated by the place, and before it can be liked or disliked or whatever. It seemed it's a response to that. Maybe it's because we're scared of that. I mean, I know you have a different view, like of Dutch housing, which I visited a lot of, and I think you have as well, and we have completely different views of that achievement, which I think is an achievement in some ways. But
Amen. Thank you very much. I would like to invite you all to come back tomorrow night where the other side get to bat. Emily Apter will be talking about Deleuzian nomadologies. Thank you, Adam and Peter. Good night.